And we have Mike Cook on the line from Creation Ministries International. Good afternoon to you, Mike. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Mick. It's great to be back again. I can't believe how quickly that week's gone, but it's a privilege to be talking to our friends in Australia and look forward to our time together.
Yes, it's been an interesting week, I've got to say. I've seen some very interesting stories in the media, as you have. We were just talking about some of the stories. One of them to do with, I don't even know it was a medical issue. One of them was in regards to Yosemite, the national park over in the United States. Apparently, the guys who originally put the date on it have got it wrong. And the new guys doing the dating, they say, no, it's only 4% as old as what the original estimates were. And I thought, yeah, okay, well, do they still even know, or are they just guessing at it again? And it's interesting how when they get to the millions of years, they just don't get it right. We were talking a little bit about it last week, Mike. How do these guys age rocks?
That's a really excellent question, Mick, and one, of course, based on the Bible's time frame, which is based on the chronologies and so on, we come up with an age of the Earth, in the order of thousands of years, and yet people say, well, science has proven that the Earth is 4.54 billion years old, and the Big Bang was about 13.7 billion years ago. We know that from science, but so time is really important. If the millions of years aren't true, then evolution is dead in the water. But also, if the millions of years are true, then the Bible is not credible, and effectively all we believe in, including the gospel, falls apart. So time is important. But yes, one thing I can say straight up, as I mentioned, I'm involved in environmental monitoring. I'm not a scientist, but I'm involved with a lot of scientists. And there's some amazing science that's done, but you cannot directly measure the age of anything. You never could before, you can't now, and you never will be able to directly measure age. And so we can talk a bit about radiometric dating, carbon dating, or the dating of volcanic rocks and fossils. So I think the age of the Earth is a really important thing for people to understand in a basic level how these dates are obtained.
So my question there is, yes, we've heard a little bit about radiometric dating, but rocks, how do they come up with a number? They must have a method of coming up with those numbers.
They do. Okay, I've got a really good example here. In New Zealand, of course, we know that we're called the Shaky Isles. We have a fault line, the Pacific and Australian plate fault line goes right through New Zealand, so we have volcanoes, we have earthquakes and so on. And there are some volcanoes in the centre of the North Island, and back in 1949, 1954, 1975, there were eruptions, and scientists took rocks from that volcano and had them radiometrically dated. And they came back with various ages up to 3 million years old, and yet people had seen the eruption occur only a few decades before. So what they do is they basically measure the ratio of different elements and materials in the rock, and they can do that very accurately using operational science we talked about last week.
Yes.
So they come up with how much of what we call the parent thing like potassium and how much of the daughter like argon, two elements, one changes into the other over time, and they come up with these measurements, and then they apply assumptions saying, well, we assume there was nothing in the beginning of the daughter, and we know the decay rate, therefore we can calculate the age based on what we measure in the present. But there are lots and lots of assumptions in that method.
So the fact that they got that so very wrong when they were using this radiometric technique to measure those volcanic rocks, how do they still call it a reasonable method of coming up with ages?
Well, that's right. So what happens is, if you imagine you've got, say, 100% of the parent and nothing of the daughter when the rock is liquid, they make the assumption that when the rock lava is liquid, all the gas bubbles out, the rock solidifies, therefore we have a 0 point. We start then counting the clock from there. But how do you know that all the argon was emitted? How come there was none left? So see, what assumption one is that there's nothing at the beginning, and number two is, has anything been added or taken out over time? You don't know. And so when they end up with a date like this, they say, oh, it's too old. Well, it must have been contamination from argon. You see, there's always a way to account for the differences. All you're really measuring is how much argon there is in the present.
Wow. But I mean, they still use radiometric dating on rocks, yet they got it so wrong, and it just seems ridiculous that they just keep doing it, even though they got it so wrong.
That's right. See, it's interesting when you're dating rocks like volcanoes and so on, they use the radiometric dating, but when they find a fossil nearby that could be associated with a particular rock, the fossil date will always win. So they date the rock and they come up with X million years. But if they find a fossil nearby that goes, oh, this fossil's too young, it's too human-like or something, it doesn't fit with the radiometric date, they will then throw the radiometric date away and say something's gone wrong and do it again. You see, so the fossils will always win over the radiometric dates, which shows that neither are absolutes.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, it just shows how silly it is. The dates that we hear each and every day, particularly on TV, and they're dates that people have, given us based on someone else's dates, which are often based on someone else's dates, which are based on someone else's dates, which come from somebody who did radiometric, dating on something close by. And at the end of the day, we just go ahead and believe them, yet they can be so wrong. We're with Mike Cook right now in New Zealand, and we've been talking about, radiometric dating. And right now, 5 minutes past 4, and we have Mike Cook on the line from New Zealand. He's with Creation Ministries International, talking to us a little bit today about dating, radiometric dating. Of course, I saw a story. It was on Science Alert, I believe, and they were talking about how, it was on another creation site. That's right, and they were talking about how the Yosemite National Park, that was given a date of, literally tens of millions of years old, they've revised it way down. It's now only 4% as old as what they originally said, which is way different to the original age. And, we still believe whatever they tell us, even though they've just changed it by such a huge amount. But it's still in millions, and we still question, how do they come up with the millions? And we've just been listening to Mike telling us about radiometric dating and how it's really not very accurate. And Mike, you were just telling me about other inaccuracies.
That's right. So again, just emphasising that any dating method, whether you're looking at tree rings or layers, ice layers and so on in a glacier or ice shelf, anything, when you're dating something, you're looking at something that changes with time, and you make a measurement in the present of how much you have or how many layers you have or how many rings you have. That's real science as far as operational science goes, and it can be done very accurately, but we don't know what the history of the sample is, therefore we have to make assumptions. And we mentioned in the past that of course, creation.com is our website. If listeners would like to go and see a really good example of this example where radiometric dating was overtaken by the fossil dates given to various fossils found. So the radiometric dating was discarded, and the fossil dates set what they eventually accepted. So if you go to creation.com and just look for an article called "The Pigs Took It All," The pigs took it all, and that's all about the dating of Round Lucy and so on back in the 1970s and so on, with the Leakeys, Lewis and Mary Leakey and Richard Leakey and so on. So there's really good science. Yep. And Kay Behrensmeyer, so very clever people, about how the dating method changed over a couple of decades because of this disconnect.
And of course, Lucy was meant to be like one of the oldest fossils we've found of a human or something, wasn't it?
That's right, and of course now it's very controversial, but yes, it's still held up as an ideal common ancestor for us and so on, or one of our ancestral lines. But yes, it's increasingly falling apart. They found that part of the fossil was actually a baboon bone and so on. So we've got some really good articles on Lucy as well. Lucy's No Lady and so on. So easy to read articles about dating fossils, hominid fossils, and where the assumptions are on top of the real science.
Wow. So, okay, now we're saying the assumptions on Lucy. She was obviously in a pile of bones. Possibly some animal had eaten a human and a few other things. And so now they're realising there's more than just human bones in that pile.
And what's amazing is when you see how many fossils there are that are actually used to give the evolutionary line of humans from the original ape-like ancestor, a common ancestor with chimps, the actual amount of fossil evidence used is very, very sparse. I have heard it's enough to cover a billiard table, I think it is, but that may be wrong, but it's very, very sparse, and huge assumptions are made on very fragmented remains. Yeah,
I can remember seeing a couple of years ago a new dinosaur that they found, and the artist's impressions, I've got to say, were brilliant. They showed they even showed this dinosaur with feathers, and they showed the feathers and how good it looked, and the exact shape of the dinosaur and its mouth and the shape of its head and tail. And apparently all they found was a little piece of its jaw. And they came up with all of that just from a piece of jawbone. And I thought, wow, don't we 4 minutes to 5? And we have Mike Cook on the line from Creation Ministries International. We've been talking about dates of rocks, which is quite interesting. And in fact, we have a question that's come in, Mike. It is, can you tell me what is the current age called?
That's a really good question. So many of your listeners will probably have heard different time frames or geological ages like the Jurassic and the Triassic and Permian and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So we're currently in the Holocene is what the official term is. But there's a new term that's quite controversial, but there's debate either way. And some people are calling our current era or age as the Anthropocene. In other words, it's a era where geology is being affected by human input. Anthropology as the study of mankind, etc.
Yep.
So some people call it the Anthropocene era, and other people call it the Holocene, and there is healthy debate about that.
Yeah, right. Wow. Okay, so we'll find out one day which one it is, or we're just going to keep calling it both, maybe. Mike?
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, we've been talking about radiometric dating as well, and carbon dating. And
yes.
Can you sort of, I guess, shine a little bit of light, what the difference between radiometric and carbon dating is, and make it a little easier for me to understand.
A good question is often people get say, how do we date rocks with carbon dating? Well, carbon dating is a form of radiometric dating because radiometric dating basically means you're measuring something that is decaying radiometrically and carbon 14 decays to carbon back to nitrogen rather by radiometric decay. So, but the thing with carbon dating is you can only measure carbon for dating within organic material, things containing carbon, for example, bones, shells, wood, coal, etc. You can't use carbon dating to date rocks, like lava and so on. So the principles are the same, but they're very different elements, and they end up with a very different time scale too. So, things like uranium and potassium decay very slowly when we measure them today, take millions of years or whatever is the half-life, whereas carbon-14 has a half-life of about 5,730 years. Yep. So you can only really date things within the last, up to 50,000 years using carbon dating based on lots of assumptions. So they're two very different methods using the same principles.
Mm. And that's based on the environment and the amount of solar radiation and all those things being exactly the same today as it was thousands of years ago.
That's so right. And one thing I would say is that carbon dating is actually a very useful tool if you can calibrate or reference it against a known historical event. For example, if you're, say, in Europe and you go to an old inn or hotel built in 1300 and you take some samples from the oak beams and you do some radiometric dating and then you look at some other building or artifact nearby, then that can actually be reasonably useful in giving you relative dates, because if you can calibrate it against a known time frame, you know when that hotel was built. But when you have things of unknown age, then you've got nothing to reference it to. And one thing is, of course, the secular people take this idea of uniformitarianism we talked about last week, where the present is the key to the past. So as you said, people make assumptions that what we measure today, the rate at which carbon-14 forms and so on, has been stable for millions of years. But if you take the biblical time frame and history into account, of course, the world has changed hugely in the last few thousand years, including the flood and the following ice age, which made massive differences to the world that naturalists will discount as being false.
Because they don't believe in the flood.
Exactly, and that, of course, the flood would have made a huge difference to the carbon balance, locking up trillions of tons of carbon in basically vegetation and so on buried, locked up lots of volcanic CO2 coming up, very depleted in carbon-14, so the whole carbon balance would have been hugely different, making things that were buried around the time of the flood or before appearing older than they really are, because there's less carbon-14 than they would expect. So things appear to be older. So they might find a particular fossil and saying it's 38,000 years old, which is older than biblical time frame allows. But if you take the thing that the Ice Age and so on change the carbon balance, then that makes sense. There will be less carbon-14.
Wow. Yeah. So is it ice or water that changes, and how does that change the carbon balance?
It's basically, in the atmosphere you have carbon dioxide, of course, and that's nearly all carbon-12. But cosmic rays coming into the upper atmosphere cause carbon-14 to be formed, which mixes with the carbon-12, and you end up with a mixture. But of course, if the magnetic field in the Earth was stronger in the past, which we know it was, that produces less cosmic ray changes to the atmosphere. And of course, carbon dioxide that comes from volcanoes is very depleted in carbon-14. So the flood would have had a huge amount of volcanic CO2 injected into the atmosphere, which diluted the carbon-14.
Wow. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It is 18 minutes to 5, quarter to 5, and we have Mike Cook on the line. He's in New Zealand at the moment, and he's with Creation Ministries International. Been talking to us about dating and radiometric dating, carbon dating, the difference between the two. I didn't actually know the difference between the two, and some of the inaccuracies with all forms of dating, including carbon dating, and how the flood, which is something that, of course, Christians believe in. We believe in the flood. We believe there was an ice age after the flood, and so do many, other people that aren't Christian. They believe in the ice age, not so much in the flood, although we see the evidence around us here on the Central Coast all the time with the Hawkesbury River down the road. I assume you've seen the Hawkesbury River before, Mike?
I have indeed. Yeah, Sydney's a place close to my heart. My sister lives in Northern Beaches in Sydney, and I've done a lot of business in New South Wales, so I know the region very well. It's a beautiful part of the world.
It's sort of, I feel fortunate in many ways. We're blessed to live on the Central Coast and to be able to drive up and down the Hawkesbury River and see those giant layers in the sandstone rock. It makes it easy for us to explain, a giant flood, because you just look at these giant layers of different colours and you just think, well, what else could possibly do that with, such uniform sort of colours and even like the little stones in some layers and stuff like that? You sort of think it's really obvious. But I guess people living in other parts of the world that don't get to see that, I can only assume in New Zealand with, so much of the area sort of being volcanic, you wouldn't get that sort of layer to be able to say, hey, that's, from the flood. Can you see it in those sort of rocks and stones in New Zealand?
There certainly are areas that have sedimentary rock that's been laid down in the flood or post-flood events, but as you mentioned, a lot of our layers, especially in the North Island, are very volcanic, so you end up with layers of volcanic ash one on top of the other, and they're fascinating to study and to look at when you go through road cuttings and so on. You can see the volcanic layers there. But yeah, New Zealand's geology is quite unique, really, around the world. It's quite different to some of a place like Australia, which is much, much larger, of course. And so, yes, geology is fascinating, isn't it? The study of rocks.
Yes, absolutely. And look, we've only got a few minutes left. Is there anything else we can sort of mention in regard, or you can mention in regards to the dating methods?
Yes, I just wanted to finish off again. I really appreciate the time and your listeners' attention. So we talked about carbon dating. I just want to quickly close that out by, I mentioned that you can't really date, in theory, anything older than about 50,000 years by carbon dating, because there's a thing called half-lives. Each half-life, the amount remaining goes down by a half. So after about 50,000 years of 10 half-lives, you end up with not much left. So, a million years, it should be completely gone. 50,000 years is the useful limit, and by a million years, even a ball of carbon-14 the size of the Earth will be completely gone. So when we find carbon-14 detectable in things supposedly millions of years old, like coal, like diamonds, which are very, very hard and cannot be contaminated, we find them in dinosaur bones and so on. So the fact we find carbon-14 in all sorts of so-called ancient samples shows that they cannot be that old. The carbon-14 should have gone a long time ago. So in closing, just really encourage your listeners, go to creation.com, search on carbon-14, search on Hawkesbury sandstone, Three Sisters, search on dinosaur soft tissue, search on the Ice Age, search on a good God and bad things. We've got topics covered across a whole range of interesting and important areas. So please make use of our website and consider subscribing to Creation Magazine as well. It's our leading resource, family-friendly, 56 pages, comes out 4 times a year. A brilliant way to encourage you and your family with scientific and theological facts and truths that will help you in your faith.
Yes, absolutely. And I've got to say that the website as well, being able to type questions in and throw the answers back out is pretty amazing as well.
It is, and we're really blessed. We've got, we think of all the Christian ministries around the world, we believe that we've got the highest number of PhD scientists on our staff around the world, people who have given up lucrative careers in academia and science to serve the Lord, at a fraction of the income, because they really believe in what they're doing and they believe the Bible. So we have got top-notch speakers and writers around the world working on our ministry, and there are many other great creation ministries of different types around the world, all on the same page, upholding the Word of God from the very first verse.
Absolutely, and we really appreciate what you guys do. The information you give us every week is eye-opening. I mean, what you just said before about, some carbon-14 the size of Earth. I can imagine this giant chunk of carbon-14, there'd be nothing left in 50,000 years. And
a million years.
Yeah, but you're saying that when it breaks down, they'd be pretty much indetectable after 50,000 years. But you're finding it in stuff a million years old, which is pretty much proof that it can't be there. Very interesting.
Those things aren't that old, yeah.
Yes. Well, Mike, I thank you so much for another awesome week, and hopefully we'll get to speak to you again in the new year.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And again, all our blessings from New Zealand and greetings from New Zealand to all our listeners there. And I'm sure you'll get other creation speakers, our colleagues around Australasia, speaking to you. Look forward to next time. Bye.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. You're on 94.9. It is 9 minutes to